The tragic camping trip. That evening, the sky outside was as dark as ink, with only the faint light from a small fire in the yard keeping Margaret and young Jason company. She sat on an old wooden chair, her frail hands gently turning a stick to keep the fire alive. Margaret was telling Jason about a haunting camping trip that her close friend's family had experienced. The story had long remained an unsolved mystery, and Jason, sitting next to her with curious eyes, listened intently. The firelight flickered in his eyes, drawing the space around them into Margaret's unfolding tale. The crackling of the firewood accompanied her deep, mysterious voice. The fire not only warmed the cold air around them, but also illuminated stories that had been buried in the shadows of time. She began by recounting the story of a close family friend who had decided to leave the city for a short vacation in a remote countryside. It was a happy family that loved adventure and wasn't afraid of nature's challenges. The family consisted of 3 members: the father, the mother, and their young daughter Sarah, who was 12 years old with golden hair and striking blue eyes. The vacation they had planned promised to be an exciting escape from the fast-paced city life. They chose a destination deep in the countryside, a place where untouched wilderness still thrived. It was a rural area surrounded by majestic mountains and a vast, crystal-clear lake. The lush green forests stretched around them, and the wind whistling through the trees created a gentle melody. The beauty of the scene left anyone who visited in awe. But Jason, Margaret lowered her voice, her eyes reflecting the dimming flames. Sometimes, the most beautiful places hide the darkest secrets no one expects. And the land that family ventured into was just such a place. Jason shivered and pulled his wool scarf tighter around his neck, yet he couldn't look away from Margaret. Even though the fire was warm, her story was already sending a chill down his spine. Sarah's family had set up their campsite right beside the lake. From the fair, the spot looked like paradise. Clear water, the still surface reflecting the deep blue sky. The lake was nestled at the base of a towering mountain, its peak shrouded in thick fog. As if it were hiding something it didn't want anyone to discover. The father was a brave man, Margaret continued. He loved to explore, and believed that the wild was a treasure waiting to be uncovered. And that's why he chose this place without much hesitation. The family quickly set up camp, preparing for a peaceful night amidst nature. The sound of birds chirping and the gentle lapping of water against the shore created a tranquil atmosphere. Sarah ran around, happily picking flowers and laughing, unaware that everything was about to change. As the sun set, darkness began to envelop the campsite. The surrounding area fell into an eerie silence. No more birds, no more wind. Only the occasional crackling of the firewood and strange, distant noises echoing from the lake broke the stillness. Jason could feel the tension building in the story. "And then what happened, Mrs. Margaret?" he whispered, his voice filled with anticipation. Margaret continued, her tone slow but haunting. Everything seemed normal until night completely fell. The family decided to sleep early after a long day of exploring. But in the middle of the night, when they were all fast asleep, strange sounds began coming from the direction of the lake. It was an odd noise, like something heavy slithering across the water's surface, but they couldn't see anything in the pitch-black night. At first, they thought it was just large fish splashing or natural sounds from the forest. But the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, as though something was moving closer to the campsite. The father jolted awake, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped outside the tent. He shone the light around, but all he saw was the silent, still night. Yet, an unsettling feeling crept over him, and he decided to check the area more thoroughly. The lake in front of him was as calm as glass, not a ripple in sight, but the noise seemed to be coming from its depths. Margaret paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. And then, suddenly, the sound stopped. Everything returned to normal, but the atmosphere was so heavy it was suffocating. The father returned to the tent, but deep down he knew something wasn't right. Little did he know, that night was when the real nightmares began. The fire still burned, but its light no longer felt warm. Jason listened intently, not realizing that fear had begun creeping into his heart. He swallowed hard and asked quietly, "What happened next, Mrs. Margaret?" She looked at him, her eyes holding a world of mysterious memories. That night, no one in the family could sleep soundly. And by the next morning they discovered the first horrifying sign. The first night passed in a fragile peace. Sarah's family had a restless sleep, disturbed by the strange sounds coming from the lake, but nothing truly happened, aside from fleeting moments of unease. As the morning light filtered through the trees and bathed the campsite, a strange stillness lingered in the air, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Early in the morning, just as the first rays of sunlight began to shine, Lydia, Sarah's mother, decided to take a walk around the campsite. Lydia always loved early mornings in nature, when the air was still cool and life seemed to awaken slowly. She stepped out of the tent, took a deep breath of the fresh air, and let her feet guide her along the nearby trails. But after just a few steps, she suddenly stopped. Something was off on the damp ground after the night's dew. She bent down for a closer look and felt a chill run down her spine. Footprints. Large ones, pressed deep into the earth, stretching from the lake all the way to the family's campsite. They didn't resemble human footprints, nor those of any animal she had ever seen before. Lydia stood still for a moment, her heart racing, trying to make sense of it. Could it be from some kind of animal? But why were the claws so sharp? And why were the prints so deeply pressed into the ground, as if whatever had made them was incredibly heavy? Taking a deep breath, Lydia tried to stay calm and quickly hurried back to the tent. "Peter? Peter!" She called out to her husband, her voice filled with worry as she rushed through the dewy leaves. Peter, her husband, was busy preparing breakfast near the fire. He turned to her, surprised, but before he could ask, Lydia grabbed his hand and led him toward the strange tracks. "Something came here last night." Lydia's voice trembled, her eyes full of concern. Peter, a man usually calm and logical, looked down at the footprints with a serious expression. His eyes narrowed as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. He walked along the tracks, inspecting them closely. The prints were unmistakable, as if this creature had circled their camp throughout the night. Yet strangely, none of them had heard any significant noise. Peter sighed, his eyebrows furrowing in thought. "This is odd. These aren't the tracks of any wild animal we know. They're bigger, and look at those claws. This isn't from anything normal." Lydia stood beside him, the feeling of unease growing stronger inside her. "What should we do? Should we tell someone about this?" she asked, her voice edged with fear. Peter shook his head. "Not yet. It might just be some large animal. Maybe it has already gone far away. We'll be more careful, but there's no reason to panic. We're here now, so let's just continue our camping trip." Still, neither of them could deny that the atmosphere around the campsite had started to feel strange. The silence of the forest seemed unnaturally heavy. Even the birds' songs had become sparse, and the wind rustling through the leaves carried an indistinct whisper. Sarah, their young daughter, was still engrossed in exploring the area around the campsite. She was unaware of the tension in her parents' eyes, captivated instead by the beautiful stones and wildflowers she had just discovered. "Sarah, don't wander too far," Peter cautioned as he noticed his daughter beginning to run toward the edge of the lake. She turned back, beaming, and replied, "I'm just right here." But inside, Peter felt a sense of unease. Those strange footprints, the odd sounds from the night before, and now the excessive silence of nature around them. All of it gnawed at his mind. While Lydia tried to maintain a sense of normalcy and continued preparing breakfast, Peter silently checked the surrounding area once more. He followed the peculiar tracks again, this time moving toward the lake, where the prints seemed to originate. The surface of the lake was still and clear as a mirror, but looking into it, he sensed an unsettling quiet. "We should leave," he told himself. But looking back at his family, he reassured himself that he might just be overreacting. Yet deep down, Peter knew something was amiss. Those footprints were not simply from any wild animal. There was something darker at play here, and his family had only scratched the surface of a terrifying mystery. Unfortunately, they still had no idea that the choice to stay would be the worst decision of their lives. Breakfast was ready, and the family gathered around the fire, attempting to enjoy the peaceful atmosphere of their vacation. But Peter couldn't fully relax. The footprints, Lydia's worried expression, and the persistent feeling of unease clung to him, as if they were warning him of something about to unfold. And then, within that fragile tranquility, they remained oblivious to the fact that these unusual signs were just the beginning of a far more horrifying chain of events. That late afternoon, as the last rays of sunlight began to fade, the air turned chilly. Darkness gradually crept into the sky, casting a gloomy gray over the campsite. Sarah was still playing near the edge of the lake, where she often found beautiful stones and wildflowers. Her parents, Peter and Lydia, busily tidied up after dinner, not paying too much attention to their daughter. They only glanced her way occasionally to ensure she was still in sight. But in just a moment of distraction, when Peter turned to gather more firewood, Sarah had vanished. "Sarah?" Lydia called out, scanning the area. There was no response. Lydia's heart raced, worry quickly flaring up. "Sarah!" she shouted, her voice growing increasingly frantic as she didn't hear her daughter's familiar laughter. Peter dropped the bundle of firewood he was holding and rushed to Lydia's side. "Where's Sarah?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. They looked around the campsite but found no trace of her. By now, darkness had begun to envelop them, and a thick fog slowly rose from the surface of the lake, creating a white veil that obscured the entire landscape. "Sarah, where are you?" Peter yelled, his voice echoing in the stillness, but only an empty silence responded. There was no time to think. They both dashed off in a panic to find their daughter. Lydia, tears streaming down her face, ran while calling her name, hoping that Sarah was just hiding nearby and would come running out at any moment. But there was nothing. The fog thickened, obscuring all visibility. Their hurried footsteps seemed swallowed by the mist, making it impossible to see ahead, and an eerie silence blanketed the area. Peter struggled to remain calm, but with each passing minute, his anxiety mounted. "Lydia, stay calm. We'll find her. She can't have gone far," he reassured her, though his own voice betrayed his fear. Lydia continued to run around, searching every nook and cranny, every thicket, but desperation began to creep in. "Sarah! Sarah! Where are you?" Her sobs echoed, blending with the whispering wind and the haunting silence. Tears streamed down her pale face, her voice growing hoarse from too much shouting. The couple scoured the surrounding area, but each step only led them deeper into the dense fog, with no sign of their daughter. The darkness seemed to swallow them whole. and now they could hardly distinguish between the lake's edge and the forest behind them. The fog blanketed everything like a thick white quilt, hiding all traces. Suddenly, from the direction of the lake, Lydia halted, her eyes widening as she spotted a dark figure lurking behind the mist. "Peter, look!" Her voice trembled as she pointed into the distance. Peter turned, his gaze fixated on the shadow. Something stood amidst the fog, dim and mysterious. At first they thought it could be Sarah, but they quickly realized that this shadow was far too large to be a child. It stood still, not moving, as if observing them. Peter's heart raced, every nerve in his body tense as he tried to see more clearly through the thick mist. But before he could move closer, the dark figure suddenly shifted. It didn't walk like a person. It glided across the ground, disappearing swiftly and eerily silent. Lydia stumbled backward in panic, her legs frozen in sheer terror. Peter stood frozen too, a chill spreading through his body. He couldn't explain what he had just seen, but one thing was certain, it wasn't human. "How can this be?" Peter muttered, his eyes still glued to the spot where the shadow had vanished. The thick fog descended again, concealing all traces of that strange presence. There was nothing left but silence and darkness. We have to find Sarah," Lydia said frantically, but her voice broke with fear. She wanted to run toward the lake where the shadow had just appeared, but her limbs felt completely drained of strength. Peter, though terrified as well, struggled to keep himself calm. He held his wife's hand tightly, anchoring her. "No, we can't go that way," his voice firm though it betrayed a tremor in every word. "We need to find another way." Yet within Peter's mind, an unsettling feeling grew stronger. Something was wrong in this place, and he knew it. The strange footprints from that morning, the odd shadow in the fog, and Sarah's sudden disappearance, all seemed to be connected, slowly weaving a horrific tapestry that he couldn't yet comprehend. They stood in silence for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The thick fog had engulfed the entire area, and the glow from the campfire appeared to have been swallowed. The whole forest fell into a gloomy darkness, and Peter began to realize that they might be facing something beyond their understanding. Something that no light could penetrate, and the tranquility of the campsite had been replaced by a menacing shadow. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a chill. Sarah's disappearance was no longer just a case of getting lost. It had become a terrifying mystery, a nightmare that the couple never anticipated when they decided to come here. They had searched all night, groping through the fog and darkness until midnight, but there wasn't a single trace. Lydia and Peter, exhausted and desperate, returned to the campsite, their eyes hollow and pained. The atmosphere felt heavy, pressed down by an invisible weight, dense and gloomy. The chill of the night made Lydia shiver, and inside her the worry for her daughter surged intensely. Peter rekindled the campfire, its feeble flames illuminating the anxious faces of the two. They didn't say a word, sitting silently together, but in their minds, Sarah's call seemed to echo still. Lydia leaned against her husband, her body weary from fatigue. Her tears had dried up, but her heart continued to race, out of rhythm with pain and fear. "Get some rest," Peter said softly, wrapping his arms tightly around his wife. "We'll keep searching when it's light out." Lydia had no strength left to argue. She leaned into Peter and gradually drifted off to sleep, her exhausted body too worn to resist any longer. But Lydia's sleep was anything but peaceful. It quickly morphed into a horrifying nightmare. In her dream, she saw Sarah standing by the edge of the lake, soaked through, her face pale and eyes filled with terror. "Mom, help me," Sarah cried, her tiny hands flailing in desperation. Something dark and terrifying like a ghost was pulling her down into the water. Long, bony hands with sharp claws grasped Sarah's legs, dragging her slowly toward the depths of the lake. Lydia, in panic, tried to run to save her daughter, but her feet felt glued to the ground, unable to move. She screamed, struggling, but all her efforts were in vain. She watched her child being pulled down into the water, her arms flailing, mouth gasping for air amidst tears. "Mom, help me." Lydia could only stand there, powerless, her legs seemingly frozen, unable to do anything to save her child. She felt the horror creeping over her, and her heart shattered as she watched Sarah being submerged by the dark shadow. The girl's cries faded away as her small body disappeared beneath the murky water, leaving behind a still and eerie surface. Lydia wanted to scream, but her throat tightened, unable to produce a sound. She could only stand there, despairingly staring at the dark water where her daughter had just been swallowed. Each passing second felt like torture, and Lydia felt the pain and helplessness consuming every cell in her body. "Sarah." "No," Lydia screamed in delirium, tears streaming down endlessly. She thrashed about in her dream, trying to escape the nightmare, but the shadow still lingered, horrific images of her daughter replaying in her mind. The relentless agony tormented her. Peter jolted awake upon seeing his wife shivering and crying in her sleep. "Lydia, Lydia, what's wrong?" He gently shook her shoulders, trying to wake her. "Wake up." Lydia jolted awake, her body trembling, tears streaming down her face without her even realizing it. She looked around, gasping for breath, sweat soaking her forehead. Her eyes locked onto Peter's, but the gaze still held a terrible fear. She clung tightly to her husband, sobbing like a child. I saw our daughter, Peter," she exclaimed, her voice hoarse from emotion. She called for me. "Sarah is in the lake. Something pulled her down. I just stood there, unable to do anything to save her." Peter remained silent, holding his wife tightly in his arms, his hand gently stroking her tangled hair. His heart felt constricted by Lydia's words. He didn't know what to say because her dream echoed the fears he was desperately trying to suppress. Sometimes dreams are merely reflections of a troubled mind, but at other times they can be signs from another world. "Lydia, it was just a dream," Peter said softly. But even he didn't believe his own words. He could feel the unease enveloping both of them, and it made him feel utterly helpless. "No," Lydia whispered, her eyes wide as she stared into the flickering flames. "It wasn't just a dream. I feel like Sarah is trying to tell us something. Her spirit, maybe she's trying to warn us about what happened." Peter didn't know how to respond. For a moment, silence enveloped them both. The fire crackled, the sound of burning wood stark against the stillness of the dark night. He didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena, but after everything that had happened today, it felt like everything had changed. From the strange footprints, the mysterious shadow, and now Lydia's terrifying dream, it all seemed interconnected, weaving a chilling and inexplicable tale. "We will find her, Lydia. At all costs," Peter said, his voice more resolute. "Tomorrow, we will scour every inch to find Sarah. She's still alive, and we will bring her back." Lydia nodded, but deep down, she couldn't shake off the feeling of fear and emptiness left by the dream. In her mind, Sarah's image lingered, her cries echoing, pleading for help in despair. Early the next morning, as the fog gradually lifted and the weak sunlight began to filter through the trees, Lydia and Peter continued their search. The mist was no longer as thick as the night before, but the cold and dampness still enveloped the bleak landscape. They had scoured the area around the lake and the dense forest from dawn until dusk, yet there was still no trace of Sarah. The more they searched, the more evident their despair became. They had wandered everywhere, searching under every tree branch, leaf canopy, wading through muddy puddles, but all to no avail. Each time Lydia called out her daughter's name, the sound echoed chillingly in the silence, leaving only a terrifying stillness as a cold response from the world around them. Both of them were exhausted. By late afternoon, they slumped down beside the lake. The very spot where Lydia had seen the strange shadow lurking in the fog the night before. This area was far from any town, with no village or people living nearby, making the hope of finding Sarah seem increasingly bleak. Peter hung his head, his eyes staring blankly into the distance, while Lydia leaned against him, her eyes closed in utter fatigue. Their hearts felt shattered into pieces, enveloped in a sense of loss and despair. There was no sound except for the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional gentle lapping of water against the shore, but it did nothing to soothe their pain. As night fell, they lit a campfire once more. The weak flickering light from the fire was not enough to chase away the cold that surrounded them, both from the atmosphere and within their souls. Lydia sat by the fire, her eyes glazed over from sheer exhaustion. Eventually, she could no longer fight her fatigue and slowly drifted off to sleep. But once again, the horrific dream came to her. Lydia saw Sarah again, but this time her daughter's face was covered in blood. Sarah's eyes were filled with panic and despair. "Mom, please, get out of here," Sarah cried, her voice echoing from a distant place, weak yet insistent. "Mom, go, don't stay here." Lydia tried to step forward to embrace her daughter, but just as she reached out to touch Sarah, the familiar dark shadow appeared. A murky, ominous entity with blood-red eyes and grotesque black stripes running down its body emerged from the lake. Its long, sinewy arms reached towards Sarah, like twisting tree roots, and once again it dragged her daughter down into the dark waters. Sarah struggled and screamed, but it was futile. This time, as Sarah sank, her gaze conveyed not just despair, but also a warning. The bloodshot eyes of the entity seemed to bore into Lydia, piercing through her soul, as if to signal that she would be the next to be pulled into that dark, cold world. Fear and despair overwhelmed Lydia once more, her body freezing in place. Lydia jolted awake, trembling, cold sweat soaking her back. She looked around. Peter was sitting beside her, but the haunting memories of her dream made it impossible for her to calm down. She gasped for breath, tears in her eyes, her heart racing. "Sarah?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from fatigue and emotion. "What's wrong, Lydia?" Peter asked, worry etched on his face as he placed his hand on her shoulder, feeling her tremble. "Did you have another nightmare?" Lydia nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I saw our daughter. Sarah said we have to leave here. Something pulled her down into the water again, and I couldn't do anything." Peter fell silent, his face paling with concern. He knew that Lydia was tormented by the pain of losing their child and the exhaustion from days of searching. But her dream, those horrifying images, they felt too real. The night before, Lydia had had a similar dream, and now it was even more dreadful. "It's just a dream, Lydia," Peter whispered, trying to comfort her. But even he couldn't convince himself. The recurring dream, along with the presence of that terrifying shadow, seemed to be trying to tell them something. He held Lydia's hand tightly, trying to reassure her, but deep down, he felt the fear enveloping them both. From that night on, Lydia never fully recovered. She began experiencing severe chills, and her body weakened rapidly. Every night, she dreamed of Sarah, and that dark shadow continued to haunt her, each time dragging Sarah down into the lake, leaving Lydia with an indescribable sense of helplessness. Peter tried to take Lydia back to the city to see a doctor. But the journey was too far, and Lydia's health deteriorated. By the time they arrived, she could no longer hold on. She passed away shortly after starting treatment, and her death left Peter with a pain that could never heal. People said Lydia died from fever, but Peter knew that wasn't the only reason. A part of Lydia had died the moment Sarah disappeared. She never got over that loss, and perhaps in some way the shadow from her dreams had stolen her soul. Her spirit had been pulled into the same darkness that had drowned Sarah, and Peter could never accept the truth that both his wife and daughter had vanished forever. After Lydia's death, Peter completely fell apart. He lost all desire to live. Each day passed with him sitting in the empty house, drowning in alcohol and a deep yearning for his wife and child. Images of Sarah and Lydia haunted his mind, and the eerie shadow continued to torment him. He knew that something beyond human understanding was at play, and that only added to his agony. On a cold autumn day, Peter's body was found by the lake where he and Lydia had once camped. No one knew why Peter had returned there, but perhaps he missed his wife and daughter so much that he went back to where it all began. Or maybe the shadow that Lydia had dreamed of had come to take Peter away, just as it had done with Sarah and Lydia. Peter's body lay cold by the lake, the place where he had experienced the greatest loss of his life. A happy family had vanished, leaving behind only tragedy and pain. No one knew for sure what had happened, but those around believed that Peter's soul had reunited with Lydia and Sarah, whether in this reality or in the dark void beyond. Mrs. Margaret silently shed dry tears as she looked at the boy Jason sitting beside her, his innocent eyes wide with concern. "Why are you crying?" he asked, his voice trembling with worry. But Margaret didn't answer right away. She was lost in old memories, painful recollections of Lydia, her dear friend who had lost everything on that fateful trip. That loss, that tragedy, now surged intensely in her heart, as if the story was not just Lydia's but her own life she was recounting. In that moment, Margaret felt not only sorrow for Lydia, but for her own life as well. She had once been a child who lost the love of her beloved father. The long, lonely nights and the days devoid of warm embraces had left her growing up with an endless yearning to call out, "Dad." She remembered the beautiful days of her childhood. That pain had never faded from her life. She had lived under the injustice of fate, a life filled with unspoken wounds. Now sitting next to Jason, the innocent boy who had lost both parents in a horrific accident when he was still too young, Margaret saw herself reflected in his eyes. She thought about her own unfortunate children, and now she had become the last support for this boy. She gently raised her hand to wipe away her tears, holding the boy close, feeling the warmth and the heartbeat of his tender heart. "I'm fine, Jason," she said softly, her voice warm. "Let's go to sleep." She leaned down and kissed the boy's forehead, smiling even though her heart was still heavy. She hoped that, no matter how cruel life might be, Jason would have a brighter future, a life free from the scars that she and Lydia had endured. In the dim light, she looked at her little grandson, silently praying for a better future for Jason. And no matter how full of challenges and tragedies life might be, she would protect him to the end, like a strong pillar amidst the stormy seas of life. Margaret held Jason's hand tightly, feeling a small peace in her heart, hoping that, no matter how great the pain, the boy's future would remain steadfast on his own feet, facing the bright days ahead.